Today we're going to talk about Cuba and the Cold War through the 1950s all the way up until the early 1980s. All right? This is paper 3 material. I told my kids last year, guys, be ready. We're going to know Cuba. We're going to know Cuba well. And if you guys get a question on the Cold War and Cuba during the Cold War, you're going to be able to answer it well. And those kids went into that exam so prepared and so ready, and they got that exam and they opened up to paper 3. And there was no question about Cuba and the Cold War, and they were angry with me. But guess what? Because they had no question about Cuba and the Cold War last year, it means there's a chance for this year. So, excellent. Here we go. This is a guy named Fulgencio Batista. I've got his name written over there on the right. Fulgencio Batista. In 1952, he is going to stage a coup over the democratically elected government of Cuba. Coup d'etat, it's a French phrase. It means a shaking of the state. All right? It's the phrase we use, it's the word we use when the government is typically violently overthrown. Although, when we talked about like the Czechoslovakian coup, we talked about how that really wasn't a violent coup. Though we called it a violent coup. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from the southern tip of Florida, Fulgencio Batista stages a coup over the democratically elected government of Cuba, fearing that he was actually going to lose the presidential election that he was running in. So, like, if you don't think you're going to win the election, get the military behind you and just overthrow the government. It's a good way to do it. Get yourself a big hat and you're ready to roll. The United States, despite Fulgencio Batista anti-democratically assuming power in Cuba, the United States supported him. Now, we got to think of the context of the times and think about what we talked about the other day. Do you guys remember we mentioned with the creation of the Organization of American States the other day, that we said that these American states, the United States, Latin America included, said that ideas of democracy and human rights and economic cooperation are all important. We recognize these and value these. Then why is the United States going to be supporting a military dictator in Fulgencio Batista? Well, what else is going on in 1952? Okay, it's amidst the Cold War. And even though this guy maybe isn't as democratic as we would like, he's not communist. And he's not a threat to American interests in Cuba. And we can be okay with that. We can be okay with that. Now, very early on, a lawyer in Cuba named Fidel Castro is going to attempt, through legal means, to bring a suit against the Batista regime. But you can imagine how far that this is going to go, right? The military dictator is not going to take kindly to someone challenging his rule using the laws of the Cuban state that he is now leading. Fidel Castro gets nowhere because there was no means for any kind of public debate against Batista's rule and his assumption of power. So Castro, not having a legal channel to challenge Batista's rule, is going to organize a revolutionary movement. On July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro will attempt to lead an armed uprising against Fulgencio Batista and his regime, his government. And it fails. Castro is going to be arrested and thrown in jail. And we don't hear much more for the time being from those revolutionaries. But we go back to Fulgencio Batista for a moment. And I think we see this throughout the 20th century when we talk about dictatorships, especially dictators that assume power through violent means. All right? If you are a dictator and you have people opposing your rule, you might have to be harsh in suppressing those groups, right? And as you are harsh in suppressing those people that oppose your rule, you might create more people that oppose your rule. And as you create more people that oppose your rule, you might have to be even more harsh in holding on to your position. Again, creating more people that oppose your rule. And as you create more people that oppose your rule, you have to be even more harsh against the people that are opposing your rule. And what we end up with is a brutal and repressive military dictatorship. Guys, we see the exact same thing in Southeast Asia, right? Who was the leader of South Vietnam? Ngo Dinh Diem. And he was being challenged by the Viet Cong, right? And he had to react very harshly, or he reacted very harshly towards the Viet Cong. He sent the Army of the Republic of Vietnam into South Vietnam to weed out the Viet Cong. And as he did that, what did he do? Created more animosity amongst the people, especially amongst Buddhists, which caused him to be even more harsh on his opposition, which created more animosity. We see how this works. Eventually, Castro is released from prison and he goes to Mexico. He goes to Mexico where he is going to reorganize and build a revolutionary movement that he calls the July 26th movement, after the original date that he attempted to overthrow the government in 1953. And this is their flag. The July 26th movement is Castro's revolutionary movement to bring an end to the Batista regime. Another little-known July 26th movement came in 1977 when Gloria Adobe had a beautiful baby boy who would one day teach history to people. So that was the lesser-known July 26th movement. Maybe not any less important, at least for you guys. All right.
What about my July 26th moment?
What is that?
When I was born on July 26th.
No, that is not important. That is not important. Did I know that?
Yeah, we did that. Did I tell you that before?
You might have. I repressing memories. Sorry. So anyway, Fidel Castro will organize this movement in Mexico. It is in Mexico that Fidel Castro will meet a guy that you guys will meet when you go to college on people's t-shirts. His name is Che Guevara. Che Guevara. I believe I wrote his name over here. Guevara. Che Guevara, from the 1970s on, has been a pretty popular image to kind of sketch on revolutionary-minded, or at least young-minded people that shop at stores that sell t-shirts and they want to associate with... what's that? He's in Persepolis? What's he doing in Persepolis?
He talks to Margie in
Oh.
his head.
Okay.
Oh wait, and she pretends to be him.
Oh, interesting. So anyway, it is in Mexico that Fidel Castro will meet Che Guevara, and Che Guevara essentially becomes Castro's right-hand man, and basically his strong man, his heavy, in trying to bring that revolution back to Cuba. So as more popular discontent in Cuba grows, the Batista regime becomes more and more repressive, creating, again, even more popular discontent. Fidel Castro will return in 1956 to Cuba to start leading a revolution against the Batista regime. It starts in 1956. It starts as a guerrilla movement. This is a guerrilla army, guys. G-U-E-R, right? Because they don't have an army that can compete with the military of the Cuban government. So he leads a guerrilla movement against the government of Cuba, against the military of Cuba. The United States is looking at this from outside. Who's the president of the United States in 1956, 57, 58, 59? Eisenhower. The United States is looking at this from the outside, and we see this as problematic. We had absolutely been supportive of Batista prior to these days. But as he gets more and more repressive, the United States begins to pull their financial support from his government. All right? But you guys can see, now that we know what happens, as Batista gets less military and financial aid from the United States, he is less able to repel these revolutionaries. And so in January of 1959, following a complete embargo by the United States of military shipments into Cuba, in January of 1959, January 1st, 1959, Batista will flee Cuba. And Castro's revolution was victorious. And now Fidel Castro is the leader of Cuba. But at this point, Fidel Castro isn't a communist yet. He has leftist leanings, but he's not a communist. He's not in line with the Soviet Union at all at this point. But then he begins to offer his reforms to the Cuban state. He breaks up large estates, large landed estates. Because Cuba was made up of very few, very wealthy Cubans who controlled most of the land and resources, while the majority of Cubans were living a life of poverty. Also, Cuba was dominated by foreign business interests, whether it be the American companies that developed the electric grid in Cuba, or the railroads that were constructed in Cuba, or the American corporations that are running sugar plantations in Cuba. A lot of what's happening in Cuba economically, business-wise, is being done by foreign companies in the United States. So Castro, upon assuming power, Castro is a nationalist, all right? At this point, he's not a communist yet. Remember, we had the same question about Ho Chi Minh. Was he a nationalist first and then a communist, or a communist first and then a nationalist? At this point, Castro was a nationalist. He moved to break up these large estates. He proclaimed that there would be no foreign ownership of agricultural land in Cuba. He nationalized U.S.-owned industries in Cuba, including the oil refineries of Cuba. And it is after the nationalization of the oil industry in Cuba that President Eisenhower steps in and says, whoa, 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 Fidel Castro. Yes, sir. Well, just hold on here for a second. Because he nationalizes oil first. Ike introduces economic sanctions against Cuba. Castro, you're going too far here. We're going to put some economic sanctions on you. And we're going to boycott the purchase of Cuban sugar in the United States. And now this is going to hurt Castro financially. And as he's being hurt financially, where do you think he's going to turn? The Soviet Union is more than willing to support a new friend 90 miles off the southern coast of the United States. It is here where President Eisenhower begins to formulate what becomes known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Do we recall Eisenhower's policy towards the containment of communism? We called it what? His new look. Massive retaliation was an aspect of it. His new look. One component of the new look in containing communism of Eisenhower, one component of the new look was using the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, as a weapon in containing communism, to do covert operations in order to either strengthen anti-communist governments or to strengthen anti-communist movements. So Eisenhower's administration begins planning the Bay of Pigs invasion. We already spoke about this. Remember, we would take Cuban expatriates. Guys, if you've been following the presidential election, you're probably familiar with Marco Rubio right now, right? He's a descendant of an expatriate from Cuba, and Ted Cruz. When Cuba had their revolution, I already mentioned a lot of like the former rich and powerful in Cuba that maybe were connected to American businesses, or maybe they were powerful landowners by their own right. They fled Cuba. A lot of them got out of Cuba, and they sought asylum in the closest place, the United States. And the United States in the 1950s and in the early 60s, we welcomed these refugees. We welcomed these people. All right? Now, these people left Cuba for very different reasons than many other Latin Americans left their home country to come settle in the United States. For example, like in Mexico or other countries of Central America, a lot of the reason that people would migrate to the United States was for economic opportunity, right? For the Cuban migrants, they had economic opportunity in Cuba. Most of them were the rich and powerful of Cuba. They had educations. They had backing. They fled what Castro's revolution meant for them, possibly losing their fortunes that they had down in Cuba. Interestingly, as we're seeing in this upcoming presidential election, of all of the Hispanic Americans, which is now the largest minority group in the United States, of all Hispanic Americans, it is the Cuban Americans that are most closely aligned with the Republican Party. Because they came into the United States, most of them, during Eisenhower's administration. And the Republican Party has long been the party that was most vehement in its opposition to the spread of communism. And so this Cuban migrant group became very pro-Republican. So it shouldn't surprise us that Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz are part of this story here, okay? And the Cuban American population in Florida tends to be a very strong voting bloc for Republicans. That part of the story is going to become important as we get to the end of today's discussion. So Castro's going to break up the large estates. Castro's going to nationalize the oil industry and eventually all other industries of Cuba. The United States tries to oust him in the Bay of Pigs invasion when we use these Cuban expatriates. We train them up, but the CIA trains them in the swamps of Louisiana, and we send them back to Cuba, now under President Kennedy. This happens in 1961 under President Kennedy. We send them back to Cuba to invade in hopes of having a revolution start against Castro. Like Cubans would notice that we've sent these expatriates there, and they would say, yay, now we can finally get rid of Castro. But nobody said that. And the expatriates in the Bay of Pigs invasion were squashed. And it was an absolute failure for the United States. It was that Bay of Pigs invasion, though, remember, that caused Fidel Castro to realize how tenuous his hold on his country was. That he has the most powerful military on the planet, 90 miles away, and ready to oust him from power. And so what does Castro do? He signs a defensive alliance with the Soviet Union. And he agrees to let the Soviet Union place long-range nuclear missiles into Cuba. And this is what brings the Cuban Missile Crisis. By this time, the United States has launched a complete trade embargo against Cuba. We've launched a complete trade embargo against Cuba that lives on till this day. We still have a trade embargo against Cuba. Barack Obama has recently lessened some of the restrictions against Cuba. For example, you can travel to Cuba now. What's that? Oh, yeah? So you can travel to Cuba, but you are still not able to do business with Cuba like you can with other nations, which I find kind of interesting, because remember, this happened 50 years ago. All this went down. Are there any other communist nations that the United States formerly had beef with that today we have sound economic relations with? China. Wait a minute, whoa. But we're going to talk today about Cuban human rights violations. Does China have human rights? Oh, okay, they do. Yeah. Vietnam, right? We fought a war in Vietnam against the North Vietnamese, and now we do business with Vietnam, with the nation of Vietnam. But Cuba, we still have this sticking point, right? We've still maintained this embargo. Don't underestimate the power of that Cuban-American voting bloc in Florida. Don't underestimate the political importance of the state of Florida. Yes, sir?
Well, plus, Castro never went out of power like Mao did in China.
That's a good point, too.
Or Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam.
That's a good point.
Anti-American rhetoric never went down.
That's true. That's true. Good point. So we press on. Castro's reforms, we've talked about. After 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro is going to continue, or begin, I should say, to support liberation movements. Castro is going to support liberation movements of poor or formerly imperialized nations, particularly in Africa. He's going to lend his support for international revolutions against imperial powers. And here we see some Cuban soldiers that have gone to Africa, and they are working in an anti-imperial war in Africa, taking part in the anti-colonial movements in Africa. But here now the United States is deeply concerned, because Cuba, 90 miles away from Florida, is looking like it wants to spread communism. And they're not just doing this in Africa, they're also supporting communist movements in Latin America, in other countries in Latin America. For example, Che Guevara. In the mid-60s, Che Guevara goes to Bolivia and starts to support a revolutionary movement in Bolivia. We'll talk about this in a moment. It is ultimately there where Che Guevara will be captured and ultimately executed. So we are deeply concerned that the Cuban Revolution will spread to other nations. Yes, sir?
Where did the Cubans get the money to send troops all the way to Africa from?
They're getting some aid from the Soviet Union. Yeah, the Soviets are offering aid as well. But the Cubans nationalized their industry, and they're selling to other nations. But remember, the people of Cuba, they're not living high on the hog here. Absolutely, we can talk about that in a few minutes here. So Castro is going to support these anti-colonial movements around the planet, which has got the United States concerned that the Cuban communist experiment could spread to other places. All right? And that's where we started talking the other day about the United States intervening in Ecuador, the United States intervening in Bolivia, the United States intervening in Brazil, the United States intervening in Chile, the United States getting involved in the United States intervening in the Dominican Republic, the United States getting involved in these Latin American countries because we didn't want to see the same happen. Even if it meant supporting distasteful military dictatorships that they themselves would violate human rights of their citizens. Because we are weighing what is the worst scenario here. Would you rather support a military dictator that is friendly with you, or would you rather have a new communist dictator in opposition to the United States? And the United States chose the military dictators that are friendly with us, at that point at least. What is Castro up to domestically? What is Castro up to domestically? Here's Castro getting very excited with Nikita Khrushchev, and who's this guy down here? Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev, eyebrows. Gorbachev, birthmark. Okay? Domestically, the Cuban economy is going to be transformed from a capitalist, U.S.-dominated state into a socialized state with nationalized industry and agriculture. Do we understand what I mean by those phrases? The state, the Cuban state, will take over Cuban industry. The Cuban economy is going to be transformed from a capitalist state with heavy American influence to a state of nationalized industry and agriculture. Yes, sir? Typically, yes, because it's the state taking over the industry. And what is socialism? It's the state controlling the means of production of a society. When couldn't it? If you oust, I guess you could have a scenario where you oust foreign owners of an entity and let a private corporation within your own state run it, but that never. Well, you're ousting foreigners, but yeah, I guess you're right. All right. In Cuba as well, Castro will create a universal healthcare system. A universal healthcare system. And this is the first universalized healthcare system in the Western Hemisphere, where the government will give large investments to the training of doctors and into the construction of hospitals in Cuba. And this will give Cuba, even to this day, one of the best medical systems on the planet. Fidel Castro is going to be a strong advocate for gender equality and women's rights in Cuba. Cuba, steeped in the patriarchal system of the European colonizers, Fidel Castro will move to make Cuba more egalitarian in terms of gender relations. The government will make guarantees of equal pay for equal work in Cuba. And in 1975, Castro's government will announce the Family Code of 1975. That was meant to alleviate what we call the double burden that many women in westernized societies face. The double burden meaning, like traditionally speaking, the husband went off to work while the mom stayed at home and took care of domestic responsibilities. But now we see more and more men going off to work and women going off to work, but the women suffer from the double burden of still having to take care of those domestic responsibilities despite her spending her time at work. Now, there is no such double burden in the Dobie household. In fact, I think it could sometimes go the other way. No. My wife, this is, we'll call a brief timeout here for just the change, the sweeping changes in gender relations over human history. Going back to what we talked about back in AP World. When we were hunter-gatherers, you guys ever hear the phrase, who brings home the bacon? Yeah. Like, meaning, like, literally who brings the food home? I guess maybe that wouldn't be used in all cultures. But anyway, who literally is bringing home the food tends to have the dominant role in society, right? When we were hunter-gatherers, the guys were like off doing the hunting side of it, and in many cases, they would come up empty. You guys, those of you that have dads or hunt yourselves, you know you often go hunting and then you're just basically hanging around in a shed by yourself doing nothing all day long. So you don't always bring home meat. But the women who were doing the gathering of the nuts and berries, they're much more successful. So calorie for calorie of what people consumed in the prehistoric ages, the women were every bit or even more important in terms of producing caloric intake for the clan, for the groups. As we became agricultural, as we had the Neolithic Revolution, we start to see women producing children more, having more children, because those children are going to become your laborers. And the women having to stay closer to the home to take care of the youngest children. And so the women beginning to take over domestic responsibilities, while the males are off working in the fields, literally bringing home the bacon, right? And this is going to last for a couple thousand years. In modern Western developed societies, we see more and more women now going to colleges and universities. We really see this starting in the 1960s. Why in the 1960s? Well, we see a dramatic boost in the number of people going to college. That GI Bill. After World War II, more people went to college than ever before. Their sons and daughters in the 60s, if the dad went to college, he wanted his sons and daughters to go to college as well. So as women started to go to universities in greater numbers and be able to find jobs that are higher paying jobs, they are now less reliant on a male to bring home the bacon, to provide sustenance for herself or her children. So we're going to see divorce rates or single parenthood numbers start to rise in Western society. And ultimately, like if I were to tell my wife, who is a hardworking teacher just like I am, if I were to tell her, hey, woman, cook me some dinner, she would say, hey, man, no. I'm not going to continue living with you if you treat me like this, and you will be a single person, and then you will cook for yourself every night. And I say, okay, fine. And so now the way it works is when I don't say, hey, woman, I'm going to go watch the football game with my buddies. I say, hey, would it be okay? I mean, if it's okay with you, this is a game. It's kind of a big game. Some of my friends are going to be there, and I don't know. It's going to be from like 1 to 4. But seriously, if I just go between 2 and 2:15, that'll be fine. And then I'll come home and I'll shop and I'll cook dinner. And then that'll be, is that okay? Can I do that, please? No? Okay. That's how it works now. Or at least maybe that's just my house. But anyway, Fidel Castro tried to legislate, essentially, in Cuba, the end of this double burden by creating this family code of 1975 to more equalize domestic responsibilities. Now, here's the reality. What's going on in the homes of these people, despite this family code? It's still got the vestiges of the patriarchal society. But the communist government is talking a good game for gender equality. I got more for you. Education. The government will nationalize the education industry. No more private schools in Cuba. Literacy rates in Cuba will skyrocket following a literacy campaign to teach every Cuban to read. And now Cuba has got, despite being a very poor country, some of the highest literacy rates on the planet. I already mentioned the nationalization of industry, the nationalization of sugar and oil refineries, and the electrical power plants and the railways and all the industries of Cuba will be nationalized. And I know what many of you are thinking. Wow, this sounds like the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? This sounds like a lot of what we're hearing about. So what's the catch? Well, okay, there's a lot more that goes along with this. Because while Castro attempts to turn it into a communist utopia, we've got a lot of problems with Cuba. There's not a lot of technological development. Consumer resources are hard to come by. Consumer goods are hard to come by. If you look at the streets of Havana, Cuba, it kind of looks like a poorly kept Woodward Dream Cruise, where people are driving around American cars from the 1950s, yet they've done nothing to keep them shiny and in good repair. Because there have been no American cars for sale in Cuba over the last 70 years, or 60 years. And the Soviet cars that could have been imported into Cuba, they're not going to last that long for them. And so you've got that aspect, the lack of consumer goods, all right? You've got other issues with there's absolutely no political freedom in Cuba. No choice that the people would have to choose their leadership. We have countless stories of Cuban refugees taking some of those very own Buicks I just taught you about, or told you about, and building a raft around them and using them to try to make it the 90 miles to the United States. And in many cases, that is a death wish, all right? That those makeshift boats will never make it, and many Cubans will drown in that attempt to get to America, all right? We're going to talk to you or show you in a moment or share with you a story about a group of people known as the Freakies in Cuba. And I don't want to spoil the story, but people doing outrageous things to have some semblance of freedom in a society where you absolutely aren't free. So while Cuba is offering universal health care and free education for its people, and offering more gender equality, the nation is going to languish as one of the poorer nations in the world. It's going to be propped up, though, because of its relationship with the Soviet Union. In 1972, Cuba will join Comecon. We've already talked about this, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. The Cuban economy will be tied to these other communist economies like the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And Cuba will receive huge foreign aid from the Soviet Union. But what happens in 1991? Soviet Union collapses. There's no more aid. And an already poor Cuba falls into even more poverty. Questions, comments, concerns?